check out this shrine with me. I see Tori, Shimenawa, and here's the Shinto priest who runs the whole thing. You might think we're looking at a shrine somewhere in Japan, maybe Tokyo or Osaka, but we're actually looking at a shrine near Seattle. Reverend Lawrence Koichi Barish is an Aikido master and the licensed head priest of Tsubaki Grand Shrine of America in Granite Falls, Washington. He's one of a handful of non-Japanese Shinto priests scattered around the world and claims to be the first non-Japanese Shinto priest. Some people say that Shinto is a uniquely indigenous Japanese religion, but for people like Reverend Barish, Shinto is not limited to Japan or people with Japanese heritage. As he said in interviews, there is something universal in Shinto that can enhance everybody's spirituality. However, is it even possible for a religion to be indigenous and universal at the same time? In this video, we'll consider claims that Shinto is an indigenous cultural tradition and a universal religion to try to answer this question. Let's start with the easiest question. Who says Shinto is an indigenous religion? Well, the Association of Shinto Shrines, or Jinja Hansho, does. On their website, they define Shinto as the indigenous faith of the Japanese people. Shinto is more than a religion and encompasses the ideas, attitudes, and ways of doing things that have become an integral part of the Japanese people for the better part of 2,000 years. Scholars of Japanese religion agree that this is the most common definition of Shinto. We cannot deny that kami veneration and related ritual practices have a long history of contributing to the fabric of Japanese cultures, as have other traditions like Buddhism and Confucianism. And of course, indigenous religions deserve our respectful analysis and attention. The point of this video is not to trash this idea that Shinto has deep roots in Japanese culture, but to explore the power of its definition as a unique and exclusively Japanese tradition and how it accomplishes several goals at the same time, not all of which are positive goals. As we talked about in episode 3, starting in the late 1800s, the modern Japanese government gradually brought the majority of Shinto shrines under their control in a system now called State Shinto. Thousands of shrines were also created, but not just in Japan. The Japanese Empire also established overseas shrines within their colonial territories, including Korea, China, and Taiwan. Advocates hoped that requiring colonial subjects to participate in ritual veneration of the imperial kami would promote loyalty and patriotism in the new territories. For example, the Chosen Shrine, which was the highest-ranking Shinto shrine in Korea until it was demolished in 1945, enshrined Amaterasu and Emperor Meiji himself. So we can already see a gap in the argument for Shinto's status as an exclusively Japanese religion. Shinto jumped Japan's borders to other countries and cultures in relatively recent history, albeit by force. But it's precisely this dark episode in Japan's history that this narrative is also meant to resolve. After World War II, the Shinto establishment worked hard to rehabilitate its image. Scholars and priests argued that Shinto had been corrupted and forced to support the state's nationalist ideology and colonial agenda. They denounced violence and assured people that Shinto was originally a cultural or ethnic way of life which promotes peaceful coexistence and harmony with nature. In this light, reclaiming Shinto's indigenous identity could provide a spiritual resource for rebuilding post-war Japan and mending international relations. The claim that Shinto is the sum total of the Japanese way of life also has the added benefit of positioning most Shinto shrines and effectively all Japanese people under Jinja Hansho's authority. The organization claims to have 110 million Shinto parishioners. That's roughly 90% of Japan's population. Hey everyone, Andrew from the future here. So I was actually working with outdated numbers there. Jinja Hansho now claims that 119 million Japanese people are official followers of Shinto. And they actually use that terminology on their website, official followers. However, scholars of Japanese religion like John Breen and Mark Twain note that all the indications are that Shinto, as opposed to say Jinja or Kami, has no meaning at all to the vast majority of Japanese people. So remember from previous episodes in this series that most Japanese people do not identify as Shinto, even if they regularly attend Shinto shrines, and many more do not distinguish between Shinto and Buddhism. Why am I bringing this up? Well, we can see that Jinja Honcho is making an indigenous argument. By claiming that the vast majority of the Japanese population is Shinto, they are tying Shinto identity with Japanese identity. Now, scholars of Japanese religion like Breen and Tuin worry about this because they argue they're seeing a disconnect between people's actual beliefs and practices and what they see as Jinja Honcho's ideological agenda. A bunch of nationalists in Japan to this day argue that Shinto is the bedrock of society, that Japan is a sacred nation, and that the emperor is of central importance to the state. But for many other people, this vision of Shinto as returning to the center of both private and public life is a little too close to wartime propaganda. Okay, back to you, Past Andrew. So, to summarize, defining Shinto as the unique indigenous faith of Japan is popular and persuasive for all sorts of reasons. And these reasons range from providing hope and strength for the present and the future, to problematically rewriting or ignoring Japan's recent history in the 19th and 20th centuries. However, recent studies on Shinto are pretty skeptical of Shinto's unique indigenous status. But is there any proof that Shinto could be considered a universal religion? One that extends beyond Japanese borders and cultural identity? And here's where we return to the example that started this whole video. Shinto priest Lawrence Barish and his statement that there is something universal in Shinto that can enhance everybody's spirituality. There is some historical precedent to universalizing Shinto. A Japanese intellectual named Ogasawara Shozo was one of the leaders of the overseas shrine projects that I mentioned earlier. Ogasawara envisioned kami as a universal spiritual force, and Shinto as an inclusive polytheistic tradition that could incorporate not just Japanese colonies, but all nations and their native traditions into a pluralistic global Shinto society. For example, Ogasawara was heavily invested in a debate over which kami to enshrine in the Chosen Shrine in Seoul, Korea. He advocated for it to enshrine Dongun, the legendary founder of the Korean nation, rather than the Japanese patron goddess Amaterasu. Now, he lost this debate, and Ogasawara's universalist vision was abandoned in the lead up to World War II in favor of the suppression of local religious traditions and the promotion of the imperial cult. After World War II, the majority of overseas shrines in former Japanese colonies were destroyed. But while colonial shrines are all but history, Japanese immigrants around the world have built their own Shinto shrines, particularly in Brazil and Hawaii. For example, check out Daijingu Temple of Hawaii, located in Honolulu. The website says that it enshrines the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami, the myriads of kami who flank Amaterasu Omikami, and interestingly, some figures from American and Hawaiian history. The national father George Washington, the nation's restorer Abraham Lincoln, as well as King Kamehameha, the founder and first ruler of the Kingdom of Hawaii. It's worth noting here that there were shrines built in the mainland US, and they were seized during World War II when Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. The Daijingu Temple of Hawaii was also confiscated and auctioned by the US government during World War II. But now, according to their own website, it enshrines national heroes of the US as foreign kami. It kind of reminds me about how Ogasawara tried to advocate for enshrining Dongun in the Chosen Shrine. As Caitlin Ugeritz's research shows, new Shinto shrines are being built around the world and attracting all sorts of people, not just Japanese communities. Native Japanese Shinto priests have set up shrines in the United States. They describe Shinto as a spiritual tradition indigenous to Japan, but with universal appeal on account of its environmental and pacifist values. Ugeritz recently surveyed Western Shinto practitioners on Facebook, and she found that many have miniature home altars called kamidana and practice regularly. They may support different shrines or venerate different kami, but they generally characterize Shinto as a ritual tradition that promotes gratitude in one's daily life, personal development, and harmony with nature. Jinja Honcho has generally discouraged shrines from providing ritual services online, but in 2020, many shrines started streaming rituals and festivals online because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This has made the world of contemporary Shinto more accessible to global audiences than ever before. Considering contemporary Shinto's environmental relevance and increasing recognition, time will tell that if we're witnessing the birth of a global Shinto tradition. When we hear that Shinto has always been the indigenous religion of Japan, we have to ask ourselves, who and what is Japanese in this scenario? Do Korean immigrants in Japan count? Does Reverend Barish count? What about former imperial subjects like the Ainu in Hokkaido, who have their own native indigenous religious traditions? It's equally important to look at why certain people are included and excluded when it comes to envisioning a shared Shinto heritage. We cannot take conventional definitions of religion at face value, especially if we are defining a religion as indigenous, universal, or a world religion. I don't mean that definitions are meaningless and untrustworthy, just the opposite. Our definitions of religion are incredibly powerful. They help shape our vision of history and our place in it. They influence our sense of identity and community, and they support certain people's claims to authority and authenticity, or to diminish others' claims to authority and authenticity. When you think about it that way, defining religion is a very high-stakes topic. So, is Shinto an indigenous tradition, a universal religion, both, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, that was episode 4 of our 5-part series on Shinto. Now, the main researcher for this series has been Caitlin Ugoretz. She's a PhD candidate in religious studies at UC Santa Barbara, and she's an expert in Shinto in the 21st century. And she's actually launched her own YouTube channel, Eat, Pray, Anime. You should all subscribe if you want to learn more about how Japanese religion intersects pop culture. Thanks everyone, and stay tuned for episode 5.